winter of 1869 came early to the Colorado high country. By late October, the aspens had already shed their golden leaves, leaving the mountainsides bare and skeletal against skies the color of tarnished silver. In the remote settlement of Pitkin Hollow, nestled in a narrow valley between two towering peaks, the first heavy snows arrived on the 23rd of October, sealing the handful of rough-hewn cabins and the small mining operation from the world below for what would become the longest, darkest winter anyone there would ever know. The settlement consisted of no more than 14 souls. Most were men who had come seeking silver in the veins of rock that ran through the mountains like frozen rivers of promise. They were hard men, made harder by the unyielding landscape and the brutal work of splitting stone with hammers and black powder. Among them was a young couple who stood apart from the others, not in any hostile way, but simply by virtue of their devotion to one another, which seemed almost anachronistic in such a desolate place. Her name was Elizabeth Mercer. His name was Thomas. They had been married for 3 years, having met in Denver City, where Thomas had worked as a surveyor and Elizabeth as a schoolteacher. When the silver rush pulled men westward into the mountains, Thomas had followed, driven by dreams of wealth that would allow them to build a proper home, perhaps back east where Elizabeth could teach again, and they might raise children in comfort and safety. She had followed him without complaint, though the crude cabin they occupied in Pitkin Hollow bore no resemblance to the future they had imagined together. Elizabeth was 24 years old that winter. She had dark hair that she wore in a practical bun, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the mountains. Her face was angular and strong, with high cheekbones that caught the light from the cabin's single window in a way that made her appear both beautiful and severe. She was not a large woman, but there was a resilience in her bearing, a straightness to her spine that suggested she would not easily be broken by hardship. Thomas was 27, tall and lean, with the calloused hands of a man who worked with stone and earth. His face had been weathered by wind and sun, but his eyes remained gentle, and when he looked at Elizabeth, there was a softness there that the other men in the settlement noticed and sometimes mocked, though never within his hearing. He was known as a fair man, honest in his dealings, and strong enough that the mockery never went beyond whispered jokes around the evening fires. The settlement had no proper doctor, no minister, no law except what the men made among themselves through rough consensus. There was a man named Garrett who served as foreman of the mining operation, and his word carried weight. But even he would admit that Pitkin Hollow existed beyond the reach of civilization, a place where the old rules seemed to matter less with each passing day. The cabin where Elizabeth and Thomas lived stood slightly apart from the others, positioned at the eastern edge of the settlement, where the valley began its steep climb toward the peaks. It was a small structure, barely 14 feet on a side, built from pine logs chinked with mud and moss. The roof was covered with split shingles and a layer of sod for insulation against the cold. Inside there was a stone fireplace that Thomas had built himself, a narrow bed pushed against one wall, a rough table with 2 chairs, and shelves where Elizabeth kept their few possessions, a handful of books, cooking implements, and a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother. On the morning of November 3rd, Thomas woke before dawn, as he always did. Elizabeth heard him moving in the darkness, the familiar sounds of him dressing, pulling on his heavy boots, taking his coat from the peg by the door. She did not rise. She lay still beneath the heavy quilts, listening to him move about the cabin, waiting for the moment she treasured most, when he would come to the bedside and lean down to kiss her forehead before leaving for the mine. He came. His lips were cold against her skin. She reached up and touched his face, rough with several days' growth of beard. He smiled at her, though in the darkness she could only sense it rather than see it. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, and she was alone with the sound of wind moving through the pine trees and the occasional pop and hiss of the fire dying down in the hearth. She rose an hour later, when the first gray light began to seep through the cabin's small window. She dressed in the cold, her breath misting in the air, and set about her morning tasks. She built up the fire, put water on to boil, cut thin slices from a side of salt pork they had hanging in the corner. The routine was familiar, comforting in its predictability. She did not think about the isolation, the long winter ahead, the months they would spend cut off from the world. She thought only of the small tasks before her, the warmth of the fire, the smell of coffee brewing, the way the light changed as the sun rose behind the eastern peaks. The mine where Thomas worked was 3 miles from the settlement, up a narrow trail that wound along the flank of the mountain. The men would leave before dawn and return after dark, carrying lanterns that bobbed like fireflies in the distance as they made their way down through the trees. The work was dangerous. They were digging deep into the mountain, following a vein of silver that Garrett insisted would make them all wealthy. But the rock was unstable, and there had already been accidents. A man named Sullivan had lost 3 fingers to a misplaced chisel. Another, whose name Elizabeth could not remember, had been crushed when a tunnel ceiling collapsed, and they had buried him in the frozen ground with no ceremony beyond a few mumbled words. Elizabeth spent her days alone. Sometimes she would walk to the other cabins to visit with the few women in the settlement. There was Mrs. Garrett, the foreman's wife, a stern woman from Missouri who seemed to regard the mountains as a personal affront. There was a younger woman named Catherine who lived with 2 brothers, and may or may not have been married to either of them. The arrangement was never discussed. And there was an older woman, a widow named Abigail, who kept to herself and was rumored to have Indian blood, though no one knew for certain. Most days, Elizabeth preferred her own company. She would read from her small collection of books, all of which she had read many times before. She would mend clothes, prepare meals, keep the cabin clean, and she would wait for evening when Thomas would return, stamping snow from his boots, his face red with cold, his eyes bright with exhaustion and the joy of seeing her again. They would eat together by the fire. He would tell her about the mine, about the progress they were making, about the vein of silver that grew wider with each day's digging. He spoke of it as though it were a living thing, something with moods and intentions. Sometimes it was generous, yielding chunks of ore that gleamed in the lantern light. Other times it was stubborn, forcing them to blast and hammer for hours to gain mere inches. She would listen, and then she would tell him about her day, though there was usually little to tell. She might mention a conversation with Mrs. Garrett, or describe a hawk she had seen circling above the valley, or read him a passage from whatever book she was working through. These evenings were the center of their life together, the hours when the harshness of their existence fell away, and they could simply be Elizabeth and Thomas, husband and wife, 2 people who had chosen each other and would face whatever came. On the evening of November 3rd, Thomas did not come home. Elizabeth waited by the fire as the light faded from the sky. She waited as darkness fell and the temperature dropped. She waited as the other men began to return, their lanterns appearing one by one along the trail. She stood at the window, watching, counting the lights, waiting for the one that would separate itself from the others and come toward their cabin. It did not come. When all the lanterns had descended and the trail was dark, she pulled on her coat and walked to Garrett's cabin. Mrs. Garrett answered the door, her face drawn and tight. Before Elizabeth could speak, the older woman shook her head. Garrett appeared behind his wife, his expression grave. He told Elizabeth that there had been a collapse in the mine. He told her that Thomas had been inside when it happened. He told her that by the time they had dug through the fallen rock, Thomas was gone. Elizabeth did not cry. She stood in the doorway of Garrett's cabin and listened to the foreman's words, and when he had finished speaking, she thanked him in a voice that was perfectly steady and calm. Then she turned and walked back to her own cabin through snow that had begun to fall, large soft flakes that caught in her hair and melted against her skin. The men brought Thomas's body down from the mine the following morning. They carried him on a makeshift stretcher, his form wrapped in canvas, and they laid him on the table in Elizabeth's cabin because there was nowhere else to put him. The ground was frozen too hard for burial, and it would remain that way until spring, so the dead had to be kept somewhere until the earth softened enough to receive them. The usual practice in Pitkin Hollow was to place bodies in one of the empty storage sheds at the edge of the settlement, where the cold would preserve them through the winter. But when Garrett suggested this to Elizabeth, she refused. She told him that Thomas would remain with her in their cabin until he could be properly buried. Garrett argued. He told her it was not healthy, that it was not right. She met his eyes and told him that Thomas was her husband, and he would not be stored like a side of meat in some drafty shed. The foreman relented. Perhaps he saw something in her eyes that warned him against pressing the matter further. Perhaps he simply did not have the energy to fight with a woman who had just lost her husband. Whatever the reason, he allowed Elizabeth to keep Thomas's body, and the men carried it inside and placed it on the table, and then they left. closing the door behind them and leaving Elizabeth alone with her dead husband in the small cabin on the edge of the settlement. She unwrapped the canvas carefully, folding it away. Thomas lay on his back, his eyes closed, his face peaceful. There was dirt in his hair and under his fingernails. His clothes were torn and dusty from the rockfall. She spent the afternoon cleaning him. She heated water and washed his face and hands. She combed his hair. She changed him into clean clothes. The good shirt he had been saving, a pair of trousers without patches or stains. She worked slowly and methodically, her movements gentle, as though he were only sleeping and she might wake him if she were too rough. When she had finished, she pulled a chair up beside the table and sat down. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant voices. She reached out and took Thomas's hand. His skin was cold, already stiffening with rigor mortis. She held his hand anyway, lacing her fingers through his, and she began to talk to him. She told him about her day. She told him that it had snowed in the morning and that she had seen a raven perched on the woodpile outside. She told him that Mrs. Garrett had come by with a loaf of bread and that she had been kind in her own stiff way. She spoke in the same tone she had always used when they talked in the evenings, conversational and intimate, as though they were simply continuing a discussion that had been temporarily interrupted. When darkness fell, she lit a lamp and continued talking. She told him about the book she had been reading, about a character who reminded her of his brother back in Pennsylvania. She told him that she was worried about the firewood, that they were running low, and she would need to ask one of the other men to help her split more. She talked until her voice grew hoarse, and then she fell silent and simply sat holding his hand, watching the shadows move across his still face. This became her pattern. Each day she would wake and go about her tasks, maintaining the cabin, keeping the fire burning, eating small meals that tasted like ash in her mouth, and each evening she would return to the chair beside the table, take Thomas's hand, and talk to him. She told him everything that happened during her day, every small detail, every passing thought. She asked him questions and then answered them herself, taking both parts in the conversation. She laughed occasionally at memories they shared. She cried sometimes, tears running silently down her face while she spoke. The other residents of Pitkin Hollow noticed her behavior quickly. In such a small, isolated community, privacy was a luxury no one possessed. Catherine had walked past the cabin and heard Elizabeth's voice through the thin walls, talking steadily, though there was no one alive inside to hear her. She mentioned it to Mrs. Garrett, who mentioned it to her husband, who came to Elizabeth's door one evening and asked if she was well. Elizabeth assured him that she was perfectly fine. She was simply talking to her husband, she explained, the way she always had. Garrett shifted uncomfortably and suggested, as gently as his rough nature allowed, that perhaps it would be better if Thomas was moved to the storage shed now. The smell, he said. In a few more weeks, even with the cold, there would be a smell. Elizabeth smiled and told him that Thomas was clean, that she washed him every day, that there was no smell. She thanked him for his concern and closed the door in his face. The days grew shorter. The snow fell more frequently, building up against the cabin walls, drifting across the narrow paths between the buildings. The men continued to work the mine, though progress slowed as the winter deepened and the cold made every task more difficult. They would pass Elizabeth's cabin on their way up the trail each morning and on their way down each evening, and sometimes they would hear her voice drifting out into the frigid air, a steady murmur punctuated by long silences. By the end of the first week, some of the men began to avoid walking too close to her cabin. They would take a longer route back to the settlement, skirting wide around the small structure where Elizabeth kept her vigil. They spoke about her in low voices, wondering if grief had driven her mad, debating whether something should be done. But no one wanted to be the one to intervene. She had done nothing to harm anyone. She kept to herself. She simply talked to a dead man, and in the grand scheme of hardships and strangeness that defined life in Pitkin Hollow, it seemed a relatively minor transgression. Mrs. Garrett was less willing to overlook the situation. She considered herself the closest thing the settlement had to moral authority, and she felt it was her duty to address behavior that struck her as unwholesome and potentially dangerous. On the 10th day after Thomas's death, she walked to Elizabeth's cabin with a basket of food and a determination to speak plainly about the situation. Elizabeth invited her in. The cabin was warm, almost too warm, and scrupulously clean. Thomas still lay on the table, looking for all the world as though he might open his eyes at any moment. Mrs. Garrett set her basket down and launched into a carefully prepared speech about the stages of grief, about the importance of accepting death, about the need to let go and move forward. Elizabeth listened politely, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. When Mrs. Garrett finished, Elizabeth thanked her for the food and for her concern, and then she said something that made the older woman fall silent. She said that Thomas was not truly dead, not in the way that mattered. His body had stopped working, yes, but he was still present. She could feel him there, in the cabin, listening when she spoke. She said that death was not an ending but a transition, and that the bonds between husband and wife were not so easily severed. She spoke calmly, rationally, without any hint of madness or delusion in her voice. She simply stated these things as facts, the way one might comment on the weather or the state of the firewood supply. Mrs. Garrett left troubled. She told her husband that Elizabeth was more than grieving, that she had moved into some territory beyond normal mourning. But Garrett, worn down by the daily struggle of keeping the mine operational and the settlement functioning through the brutal winter, had little energy left for dealing with a widow's strange coping mechanisms. He told his wife to leave Elizabeth alone, that she would come to her senses eventually, that grief took people in different ways. The second week passed. The third. Elizabeth continued her routine with unwavering consistency. She maintained the cabin, spoke to Thomas each evening, and washed his body daily with water she heated over the fire. She was meticulous in her care of him, changing his clothes frequently, combing his hair, arranging his hands in different positions so that the joints would not lock in a single configuration. She noticed changes in him, changes that she observed with a curious detachment. His skin took on a waxy quality. His features seemed to settle and become more peaceful, as though he were sinking deeper into sleep. There was no smell, as Garrett had predicted, perhaps because the cabin was cold enough to slow decomposition, or perhaps, Elizabeth thought, because Thomas was not decomposing in the normal way. He was simply changing, transforming into whatever came next. On the 16th night, something shifted. Elizabeth was sitting beside the table as usual, holding Thomas's hand and telling him about a dream she had had the previous evening. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was lit only by a single candle on the shelf above the bed. She was describing the dream, something about walking through a forest where all the trees were white as bone, when she felt his fingers move. It was not a large movement, just a slight twitch, barely perceptible. She stopped talking mid-sentence and looked down at their joined hands. She waited, her breath caught in her throat. Nothing. She almost convinced herself she had imagined it, but then she felt it again, a small flexing of his fingers, as though he were trying to squeeze her hand, but lacked the strength. Her heart began to pound. She stood up, leaning over him, studying his face. His eyes remained closed. His chest did not rise or fall. But there was something different, some subtle change in the quality of his stillness. She spoke his name, once, then again. She put her hand on his chest, over his heart. Nothing. No beat, no warmth, just the cold stillness of dead flesh. But his fingers had moved. She was certain of it. She sat back down, gripping his hand more tightly, and she began to talk again, telling him that she knew he was there, that she could feel him trying to come back to her. She talked for hours, her voice growing rough and desperate, until exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep while sitting upright in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the table beside his still form. She woke before dawn, stiff and cold. Thomas lay exactly as he had before. His hand was icy in hers. In the gray pre-dawn light, he looked like a carved effigy, something made of wax and cloth rather than flesh and bone. She wondered if she had dreamed the movement, if her grief and exhaustion were conspiring to create false hope. But when she closed her eyes, she could still feel it, that small flexing of his fingers, and she chose to believe it had been real. From that night forward, she began to look for other signs. She would watch his face for any flicker of expression, any hint of awareness. She would listen for breath, for the whisper of air moving through his lungs. She would place her hand over his heart at different times of day, hoping to detect a beat so faint that it could only be felt, not heard. She found nothing conclusive, but there were moments, small, ambiguous moments, when she thought she detected something. A slight change in the temperature of his skin, a barely perceptible movement beneath his eyelids, the suggestion of a pulse, so faint it might have been her own blood moving through her fingers. She told no one about these signs. She knew how it would sound, how quickly they would dismiss her observations as delusion. But she knew what she had felt. She knew that Thomas was not entirely gone, that some part of him remained, trapped perhaps between one state and the next, struggling to find his way back to her. The 21st day came and went. The temperature dropped further. The snow had accumulated to such a depth that moving between the cabins required wading through drifts that sometimes reached above the knee. The settlement had taken on the character of a fortress under siege, isolated and beleaguered, its residents moving through their days with grim determination. Elizabeth's supplies were running low. She had wood enough for another week, perhaps 2 if she was careful. Her food stores were similarly depleted. She would need to ask for help, to barter or beg for what she needed to survive until spring. But the thought of leaving the cabin, of leaving Thomas alone even for the short time it would take to visit the other residents, filled her with a dread she could not quite articulate. What if he moved again while she was gone? What if he opened his eyes and she was not there to see it? On the 23rd night, she woke from a fitful sleep to find the cabin filled with a strange quality of silence. The fire had gone out completely, and the cold was intense, sharp enough that each breath hurt her lungs. She could see her breath misting in the darkness. She started to rise, to restart the fire, but something made her pause. Thomas's hand, which she had been holding when she fell asleep, felt different. Not warmer, exactly, but less rigidly cold. She sat up fully, her heart racing, and reached for the candle. Her hands shook so badly that it took 3 attempts to light it. When the small flame finally caught, she held it up, illuminating Thomas's face. His eyes were open. They stared at the ceiling, unblinking and glassy, but they were open. Elizabeth made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. She set the candle down carefully and leaned over him, looking into those open eyes, searching for any sign of recognition or awareness. There was nothing. His eyes might as well have been made of painted glass. But they were open, and they had not been open when she had fallen asleep. She spoke his name. She begged him to look at her, to see her. She took his face in her hands and turned his head toward her, but his eyes did not track or focus. They simply stared, fixed on whatever point they happened to be aimed at. Still, it was something. It was a change. It was evidence that her vigil had not been in vain, that he was indeed coming back to her, slowly, incrementally, fighting his way back from wherever death had taken him. She did not close his eyes. She left them open, and she talked to him with renewed intensity, telling him that she knew he was trying, that she would wait as long as it took, that she would not leave him, that they would find their way back to each other no matter how long the journey. Outside, the wind rose, howling around the cabin with a sound like voices screaming in languages older than words. The next morning, Catherine came to the cabin door. She had been sent by Mrs. Garrett, who was concerned that no smoke had been rising from Elizabeth's chimney. Catherine knocked and called out, but there was no answer. She tried the door and found it barred from inside. She called again, louder this time, and finally Elizabeth responded, her voice muffled and strange. She said she was fine, that she simply hadn't gotten around to building the fire yet. She thanked Catherine for checking, but insisted she needed nothing. Catherine left, but she reported to Mrs. Garrett that Elizabeth had sounded wrong, that there was something off about her voice, something hollow and distant. That evening, Garrett himself came to the cabin. He knocked heavily and announced himself. Elizabeth opened the door just wide enough to speak to him. Her face was pale, her eyes underscored with dark circles. She looked as though she had not slept in days. Garrett tried to look past her into the cabin, but she positioned herself to block his view. He asked if she was eating enough, if she had sufficient firewood. She assured him that she was managing. He offered to send some of the men to split wood for her to bring supplies. She declined politely but firmly. He asked, as delicately as he could manage, if she had given any thought to allowing them to move Thomas's body to the shed. She told him no, that Thomas was staying exactly where he was. Then she thanked him and closed the door. Garrett walked away troubled. He gathered the men that evening and explained the situation as he saw it. Elizabeth was clearly not well. She was isolated, grieving, possibly delusional. The presence of the corpse in her cabin was undoubtedly contributing to her mental deterioration. Something needed to be done, but he was at a loss as to what that something should be. The men discussed the matter, offering various suggestions. Some thought they should force the door and remove the body against her wishes, for her own good. Others argued that a widow had rights, that what she did in her own cabin was her business as long as she was not hurting anyone. Abigail, the old widow who kept to herself, spoke up then. She said that grief could open doors, that sometimes when someone lost a person they loved deeply, boundaries became thinner, and things could cross over that should not. She said the old ones, the people who had lived in these mountains long before the miners came, had known about such things. They had rules about the dead, about how to treat them, about the danger of holding on too tightly when you should let go. The men listened uncomfortably, unused to hearing Abigail speak at length, unsettled by the strange intensity in her eyes. Then they dismissed her words as superstition and went back to arguing about the practical question of what to do about Elizabeth. In the end, they decided to do nothing for the moment. They would watch and wait. If Elizabeth's condition deteriorated further, or if she became a danger to herself, they would intervene. Until then, they would leave her alone with her grief and her strange vigil. The 28th night, Elizabeth no longer left the cabin at all. She had given up even the pretense of maintaining a normal routine. She sat beside Thomas day and night, watching for signs, talking to him, waiting. She had stopped eating regularly. Food seemed unnecessary, a distraction. She would drink water occasionally, more out of habit than thirst, but solid food held no appeal. Thomas had changed more noticeably now. His skin had taken on a gray pallor, and there was a sunken quality to his features that made him look ancient, withered. But his eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling, and Elizabeth had convinced herself that they moved sometimes, tracking across the rough boards above as though following the progress of something she could not see. She began to notice a smell. It was faint, not the overwhelming stench of decay that Garrett had predicted, but something subtler, something almost sweet, like dried flowers or old paper. She did not find it unpleasant. It seemed appropriate somehow, a natural part of the transformation she believed Thomas was undergoing. On the 30th night, she heard him make a sound. It was nothing like a voice, more like a creaking, like old leather being stretched or wood settling in the cold. But it came from him, from his throat or chest. She could not be certain which. She leaned close, her ear near his mouth, listening intently. The sound came again, soft and prolonged, almost like a sigh. She wept then, tears of relief and joy, because it was proof, tangible proof that he was still present, still trying to return to her. She began to sleep beside him, climbing onto the table and lying next to his cold body, her head on his chest, her arm across him. The table was not wide enough for both of them comfortably, and she would often wake to find herself pressed against him, balanced precariously on the edge of the wooden surface. But she did not mind. Being close to him, feeling the solid presence of his body beside her, brought a comfort that nothing else could provide. The other residents of Pitkin Hollow had largely given up on trying to help Elizabeth. They had their own troubles, their own battles against the cold and isolation, and the slow grinding away of hope that came with each passing day of winter. They left food on her doorstep occasionally, and when they passed her cabin, they would look away, as though by not acknowledging what was happening inside, they could somehow make it less real. But Abigail could not look away. The old woman had seen many strange things in her long life, and she recognized the signs of something unnatural taking root in Pitkin Hollow. She began to watch Elizabeth's cabin from a distance, standing in the snow for hours, motionless as a scarecrow, her eyes fixed on the small building. She saw no smoke from the chimney on many days. She saw the way shadows seemed to move differently around the cabin, thicker and slower, as though the air itself had become heavy. She heard sounds sometimes, carried on the wind, sounds that might have been Elizabeth's voice, or might have been something else, something that wore Elizabeth's voice like an ill-fitting coat. The 35th night, Elizabeth had lost track of time. She was no longer certain how many days had passed since Thomas had died. The numbers had become meaningless. What mattered was the vigil, the watching, the waiting. She spoke to him constantly now, a stream of words that flowed without conscious thought, a one-sided conversation that had begun to feel like prayer. Thomas's body had continued to change. His flesh had begun to dry and tighten against his bones, giving him a mummified appearance. His fingers had curled slightly inward, and when Elizabeth held his hand now, She could feel the sharp edges of tendons and joints beneath the papery skin, but his eyes remained open, and sometimes, in certain lights, she thought she could see something moving in their depths. A flicker of awareness or consciousness struggling to surface. She had begun to see things in the cabin, shadows that moved independently of the firelight, shapes that appeared in her peripheral vision, but vanished when she turned to look directly at them. She heard whispers sometimes, words she could almost but not quite understand, as though people were speaking in the next room through a wall that muffled their voices. She told herself these were hallucinations, products of exhaustion and grief and too many days alone in the cold. But another part of her, a part that was growing stronger with each passing night, believed that what she was seeing and hearing was real, that the boundaries between worlds had grown thin, and that Thomas was not the only thing crossing back and forth. On the 37th night, she woke to find Thomas sitting upright on the table. His legs still lay flat, but his torso had risen, his spine bent at an impossible angle, his head tilted back so that he faced the ceiling. His mouth was open, and from it came a sound like wind through a broken window, steady and hollow and utterly without humanity. Elizabeth did not scream. She sat up slowly, her eyes wide, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She reached out and touched his arm. His skin was ice-cold, rigid. She spoke his name. The sound from his mouth did not change. She moved around to face him, and what she saw made her blood freeze. His eyes had rolled back in his head, showing only the whites. His jaw had dropped open wider than should have been possible, the hinges of it seeming to have loosened or broken. And from his mouth, from his throat, something was emerging. Not physically, not in any way she could clearly see, but she could sense it. A presence. A darkness that was using his dead body as a doorway, pushing through from wherever he had been, trying to force its way back into the world of the living. But it was not Thomas. Whatever was coming through, whatever had seized hold of the shell he had left behind, it was not her husband. She knew this with a certainty that transcended rational thought. Thomas was gone. He had been gone from the moment the rocks had crushed him in the mine. What remained in the cabin with her now was something else, something that had been drawn by her desperate calls, her refusal to let go, her 40 nights of vigil and grief and stubborn denial of death's finality. She stumbled backward, away from the table, her hand over her mouth. The thing wearing Thomas's corpse continued to produce that hollow sound, that wind-through-emptiness noise that seemed to fill the cabin and make the walls vibrate. The shadows in the corners grew deeper, darker, more solid. The temperature dropped until her breath came out in thick clouds and frost began to form on the inside of the walls. Elizabeth reached the door and pulled it open. The cold outside was brutal, but it was a clean cold, a natural cold, not the seeping wrongness that had filled the cabin. She ran out into the snow without coat or boots, running blindly toward the other cabins, screaming for help, for anyone, her voice raw and breaking. Lights appeared in windows. Doors opened. Men emerged, pulling on clothes, reaching for rifles. They saw Elizabeth stumbling through the snow in her nightdress, her hair wild, her eyes wide with terror, and they knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. Garrett reached her first, catching her before she collapsed. She clutched at his coat, trying to speak, but the words would not come properly. She could only point back toward her cabin and shake her head again and again. Garrett left her with his wife and gathered several of the men. They approached Elizabeth's cabin cautiously, carrying lanterns and weapons, though what they expected to fight, none of them could have said. The door stood open. Wind blew snow across the threshold. From inside came a sound that made the men hesitate, a low groaning that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than from any living creature. Garrett entered first. His lantern illuminated the interior of the cabin, and what he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. Thomas's body sat on the table, torso upright, head thrown back, mouth gaping, but it was not truly sitting, Garrett realized. It was being held upright by something, some force or presence that maintained its position even though the dead muscles should have been incapable of such a thing. The air in the cabin was thick, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to move with purpose, reaching out with tendrils that withdrew when the lantern light touched them. One of the other men made a choking sound and turned to vomit into the snow outside. Another began to pray in a low, urgent voice. Garrett forced himself to move closer to the table, to look directly at what had been Thomas Mercer. The corpse's eyes were rolled back, but Garrett could see movement beneath the lids, as though something were trying to look out, to see the living world through those dead eyes. He made a decision then. He turned to the men and told them to bring wood, as much as they could carry, and oil if they had any. They hesitated, understanding what he intended, reluctant to violate the sanctity of the dead. But they had also seen what was in that cabin, and they understood that whatever rules normally governed the treatment of corpses had already been violated in ways far worse than cremation. They worked quickly, bringing armloads of wood and stacking it in and around the cabin. They poured lamp oil over the walls and floor and table. Elizabeth, held back by Mrs. Garrett and Catherine, watched from a distance, no longer screaming, no longer struggling, simply watching with eyes that had gone empty and distant. When the preparations were complete, Garrett took one last look at Thomas's corpse, still sitting upright, still producing that hollow wind sound. Then he took a burning branch from a lantern and tossed it through the open door. The fire caught instantly, exploding upward in a great sheet of flame that turned night into day. The men backed away from the heat, shielding their faces. The cabin burned with unnatural speed and intensity, as though the wood itself were eager to be consumed, to be destroyed rather than continue to shelter what had taken residence within. The sound that came from inside as the fire consumed everything was not the crackle of burning wood or the collapse of a structure. It was a shriek, high and prolonged, that seemed to come from multiple throats at once, a scream of rage and frustration and something like hunger unsatisfied. The men stood watching until the cabin had collapsed into a pile of burning rubble. They watched until the flames began to die down and the dawn light began to color the eastern sky. And only when there was nothing left but smoldering ash and a few blackened timbers did they finally turn away and begin the slow walk back to their own cabins, to warmth and rest and the attempt to understand what they had witnessed. Elizabeth was taken to stay with Mrs. Garrett. She did not speak for 3 days. She sat by the fire in the Garrett's cabin, wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing. On the 4th day, she began to talk, but her words made little sense. Fragments of conversations she had had with Thomas, descriptions of things she had seen in her cabin during those 40 nights, questions about whether it had really been him trying to come back, or whether she had simply opened a door and let something else through. Mrs. Garrett tried to comfort her, telling her that grief could make a person see things that were not there, that the cold and isolation had affected her mind. But Elizabeth would not be comforted. She knew what she had seen. She knew what she had done. She had loved Thomas so much that she could not let him go. And in her refusal to accept his death, she had created a space for something dark and hungry to enter the world. When spring finally came and the snow melted and the trail down from Pitkin Hollow became passable again, Elizabeth left. She took nothing with her except the clothes on her back and the small wooden box that had belonged to her mother. She walked down the mountain alone, and when she reached Denver City, she kept walking. Some said she went back east. Others claimed they had seen her in various frontier towns, always alone, always moving, as though trying to outrun something that followed in her shadow. The mining operation in Pitkin Hollow continued for another 2 years before the silver vein played out and the settlement was abandoned. The men who had been there that winter, who had witnessed the burning of Elizabeth's cabin and what had preceded it, rarely spoke of it. When they did, usually late at night when whiskey had loosened their tongues, they would tell conflicting stories. Some insisted that Thomas's corpse had been moving on its own, possessed by some evil spirit. Others claimed it had been a trick of shadows and firelight, that grief-mad Elizabeth had positioned the body and their frightened imaginations had done the rest. But they all agreed on one thing. They agreed that for 40 nights, Elizabeth Mercer had sat beside her husband's corpse and spoken to it, and that something had answered. Whether it had been Thomas's spirit struggling to return, or something darker that had seized the opportunity presented by a widow's desperate love, none of them could say with certainty. What they knew was that some boundaries exist for a reason, and that holding on too tightly to the dead can tear holes in the fabric of the world, holes through which things can pass that should remain forever on the other side. The site where Elizabeth's cabin had stood remained bare for years. Nothing would grow there, not even the hardy mountain grasses that could take root in cracks in stone. The other cabins in Pitkin Hollow fell to ruin, roofs collapsing, walls caving in, returning slowly to the wilderness. But that one spot remained stubbornly barren, a patch of earth that seemed to reject life. as though the ground itself remembered what had happened there and refused to let it be forgotten. In later years, after the settlement was long abandoned, hunters passing through the area would sometimes report strange occurrences near the ruins. They would hear voices in the wind, conversations in the distance that fell silent when approached. They would see lights moving among the fallen timbers, small glowing orbs that drifted without pattern or purpose. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind came down from the peaks with a sound like screaming, they would swear they could hear a woman's voice, calling a name over and over, calling with love and desperation, and a grief that had outlasted death and time and memory. The story of Elizabeth Mercer and her 40-night vigil passed into local legend, altered with each retelling, embellished or simplified depending on the teller. But the core remained constant. A woman loved her husband so much that she could not let him go. She spoke to his corpse for 40 nights, and something listened, something answered. And in answering, it showed that love, when twisted by grief and desperation, can become a doorway for darkness, a beacon for things that hunger for the warmth of the living world. The mountains of Colorado are ancient and patient. They hold many secrets in their valleys and peaks, many stories of those who came seeking fortune or freedom and found instead only hardship and sorrow. The story of Pitkin Hollow is just one among thousands, a small tragedy in a landscape that has witnessed countless others. But those who know the tale, who have heard it told properly around campfires or in the back rooms of mountain saloons, understand that it carries a warning that extends beyond its particulars. The warning is this: the dead are gone. They have passed beyond the place where love can reach them, beyond the range of our voices and our longing. To refuse to accept this truth, to call out to them across that vast divide, is to invite danger not just to yourself, but to the world itself, because the dead cannot answer. They are silent and still, returned to the earth from which they came. But there are other things, older things, that dwell in the spaces between life and death, and they are always listening for voices calling across the darkness. And when they hear such calls, they answer, and what comes back is never what was lost. Elizabeth Mercer learned this truth in the winter of 1869, in a small cabin on the edge of a remote settlement, sitting beside the body of the man she loved while something else, something hungry and cold and eternally patient, slowly pushed its way through from the other side, wearing his face like a mask, using his dead flesh as a doorway. She learned it, and she ran from it, and she carried the knowledge with her for whatever remained of her life. But the knowing brought no comfort, no peace. It brought only the understanding that some losses cannot be undone, some separations cannot be bridged, and that love, for all its beauty and power, cannot conquer death. It can only stand at death's border and call out into the emptiness, hoping against hope for a response. And sometimes, in those wild places where the world is still old and strange, where the mountains rise like broken teeth against the sky and the wind carries voices from 1,000 forgotten graves, sometimes there is a response, but it is never the one we hoped for. It is never the beloved returned. It is only the darkness, patient and hungry, that has been waiting since before the first humans walked the earth, waiting for grief to crack open the world just enough that it can slip through and touch, for a moment, the warmth that has been denied for so very, very long. The winter eventually ended. Spring came to the high country. The snow melted and flowers bloomed and life returned to the valleys and peaks. But in one small patch of ground where a cabin had once stood, where a woman had kept a 40-night vigil beside her dead husband, nothing grew. The earth remained barren and cold, marked by fire and grief, and the passage of something that should have stayed on the other side. And on certain nights, when the wind blows just right, and the moon is dark, and the stars seem farther away than they should, that patch of ground still remembers. It remembers love twisted into hunger. It remembers a widow's desperate voice calling into emptiness. It remembers the sound of something answering, hollow and wrong, wearing the shape of a man, like an ill-fitting suit of clothes. The mountains remember. The wind remembers. And somewhere, in whatever place Elizabeth Mercer finally came to rest, she remembers too. She remembers 40 nights of talking to a corpse. She remembers the moment she realized what was listening. She remembers running through the snow while her cabin burned behind her, flames reaching up toward a sky that offered no mercy and no forgiveness. These memories are all that remain of that terrible winter in Pitkin Hollow. The cabins are gone. The mine has collapsed. The people who witnessed those events are long dead themselves, returned to the dust from which they came. But the story persists, passed down through generations, altered but never entirely lost, because it speaks to something fundamental in the human heart. We all fear death. We all rage against the loss of those we love. And we all, in our darkest moments, have wondered if there might be some way to bring them back, to cross that final boundary and retrieve what has been taken from us. The story of Elizabeth Mercer tells us what happens when that wonder becomes action, when grief overwhelms wisdom, when love refuses to accept the finality of the grave. It tells us that death is not a door that can be opened from our side. It tells us that some silences should not be broken with our voices. It tells us that when we call out to the dead, we should not be surprised if something else, something old and patient and eternally hungry, decides to answer in their place. This is the lesson written in ash and snow and the barren ground where a cabin once stood. This is the truth that the wind carries through the mountains on cold nights, when the boundary between worlds grows thin and the dead seem close enough to touch. This is what Elizabeth Mercer learned in the winter of 1869, during 40 nights of vigil beside her husband's corpse, in a remote settlement that time and wilderness have long since reclaimed. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend understanding. And some acts of love, no matter how pure their origin, can open doors that should remain forever sealed. The story of the woman who spoke to her husband's corpse for 40 nights is a story about all of these things. It is a story about the danger of holding on when we should let go. It is a story about the spaces between life and death, and about the things that dwell in those spaces, waiting for grief to give them form and voice and passage into our world. The cursed frontier holds many such stories. This is but one. Each story is a warning. Each story is a memorial to those who ventured too far into territories where human beings were never meant to go. And each story, if we listen carefully, teaches us that the Old West was not tamed by courage or guns or industry. It was never tamed at all. We simply built our towns and mines and railroads on top of something older, something that watched us with patient eyes and waited for our grief or desperation or pride to give it the openings it needed. In Pitkin Hollow, in the winter of 1869, Elizabeth Mercer gave it such an opening. And what came through, wearing her husband's corpse like a borrowed coat, left marks on the world that time has not erased. The barren ground, the stories, the sense on certain nights that something is still there, still listening, still waiting for another voice to call out across the darkness, so that it might once again have the chance to answer. This is the frontier that was never meant to be crossed. This is the boundary that holds back not distance or danger or wild animals, but something far older and hungrier. This is the line that love, in its desperation, sometimes tries to cross. And this is what waits on the other side, patient and cold, and eternally ready to slip through into the warmth of the living world when grief cracks the door just wide enough. Elizabeth Mercer opened that door. For 40 nights she held it open with her voice and her stubborn refusal to accept loss. And when she finally understood what she had done, when she finally saw what was coming through, it was almost too late to close it again. The men of Pitkin Hollow closed it with fire, burning the cabin and the corpse and whatever presence had taken hold there. But the scar remains, the memory remains, and the warning remains, carved into the landscape itself, written in the barren earth and the wind's cold voice. Do not call to the dead. They cannot hear you, but something else can, and it will answer. And when it does, you will learn, as Elizabeth Mercer learned, that some silences are merciful, some separations are final, and some frontiers exist not to be crossed, but to protect us from what lies beyond. The story ends here, in words and memory. But in the mountains of Colorado, in the ruins of a forgotten settlement, in the barren ground where nothing grows, the story continues. It continues in the wind and the cold and the darkness. It continues in the patient waiting of things that have no names and no mercy. It continues as a warning to anyone who might one day find themselves consumed by grief so profound that death itself seems like an obstacle that love should be able to overcome. Elizabeth Mercer thought love could overcome death. She was wrong. What love overcame was only her own wisdom and caution. What love opened was not a path to her lost husband, but a doorway for something else, something that hunger and patience and terrible purpose. And what love cost her was not just the life she had imagined, but her peace, her sanity, and the knowledge that she had played a part in bringing something dark and wrong into the world. These are the consequences written into the landscape of the cursed frontier. These are the lessons encoded in stories of those who crossed boundaries they did not understand. And these are the warnings that echo through the mountains still, carried on wind that has blown across graves both ancient and new, wind that has witnessed the slow collapse of civilizations and the quick burning of hope, wind that knows the difference between the voices of the living and the voices of things that should not have voices at all. Listen to the wind when it speaks. Listen to the stories it carries. And remember that the frontier is not just a place but a boundary, and that beyond every boundary lies something we were never meant to see, something we were never meant to know, something we were never meant to call by name or invite across the threshold. Elizabeth Mercer forgot this truth. She paid the price. And the earth where her cabin stood remains barren still, a reminder that some prices, once paid, can never be refunded, and some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again.